A very warm welcome, everyone. It is lovely to see so many of you here to learn about NVivo literature reviews. This is one of my favourite sessions to present. I'm very much looking forward to showing you what NVivo can offer your research in relation to literature reviews today. If I haven't met you before, my name's Lynn Lavery. I'm the director of an Auckland-based research company, Academic Consulting, and we, amongst other things, teach people how to use NVivo. Something I've been using for quite a while now. I've been using and teaching the software for just over 25 years. So as you can probably imagine, I think it's a pretty big important, useful, fabulous piece of software, or I wouldn't have stuck with it for as many years as I have. And I suspect you might pick up on some of my enthusiasm over the next hour. I am joined behind the scenes today by Jane George, who is going to be fielding your questions as we go through. We are encouraging folk to pop any questions you have in the Q&A panel. I just mentioned before we started the session, we've got 265 people registered for today, and I'm expecting the chat is going to get quite busy as a result. Jane and I are super keen to make sure that all of your questions are answered, so the best way to make sure you get an answer to your question is to pop the question into the Q&A panel for us. Now, a few things about today, and then I have lots of content to cover, so I'm going to get cracking on the software pretty promptly. First of all, today is a demonstration only, rather than a hands-on session. So I'm going to be working at quite a fast pace. As you'll have seen, we are recording the session. I will be sending a link to that recording later today by email. So if at any stage you think, oh, that's just a bit too fast, or I wish I could rewind, you will be able to watch it later and indeed rewind with the recording of the session. If we sort of excite you enough today that you think you want to use NVivo for a literature review, at the end of today's session, I will be talking a little bit about how you can get some hands-on training if you would like to. Now, the other thing to say is, similar to yesterday, today's session is aimed at two groups of people. It's suitable for those who are brand new to NVivo and those who are more experienced. If you are brand new to the software, just because in the interests of time and because I don't want to repeat myself, I'm not going to go over everything that I covered in yesterday's session, the NVivo showcase session. Jane has been popping a link, I know, in the chat to the recording of yesterday's session. And if you are brand new to NVivo, I would really encourage you to have a look at that recording so that you get more of a sort of overview as to the capabilities of NVivo. And I think you'll find that a useful one to watch in conjunction with today's session. The other thing I'll just ask Jane to pop into the chat is I've got a link to a PDF which has some frequently asked questions. So if you are brand new to NVivo and you've got questions like what the current version is, how you get access to the software, those sorts of things, that frequently asked questions document is in the chat for you. And just a note as well, folks, that any links we share in the chat, I will be including in the follow-up email from today's session as well when I send the recording. Now, for those of you that are more experienced with NVivo, I have some good news for you. You do not need to learn anything special in order to use NVivo for a literature review. So if you are currently using it for working with primary data, things like interview transcripts, perhaps field notes, web pages, social media data, survey data, that kind of thing, everything you already know about NVivo actually also applies to lit reviews. So no need to learn anything new. I think you'll find today's demonstration, though, which is based on a literature review project, will be very helpful for you in terms of putting a few pieces of the puzzle together. So that's all my sort of intro comments out the way. I have just spotted that someone does have their hand up. So just a note that we are taking questions via the Q&A panel rather than getting people to pop their hand up and ask verbally, just because of the number of people we have in the room today. So feel free to pop your question into that Q&A and we will more than happily answer that for you. Right, without further ado, let's get cracking. So, my plan today, I'm going to begin by just talking you through what types of literature you might work with in NVivo. And we'll talk about how you can go about importing that literature to an NVivo project. I have a project set up. I'm actually got a sort of two-stage setup here. So I've got a literature review project in the very early stages that we're going to be starting with. And then once we've done a few things in that, I'm going to be jumping across. It's a little bit like a bad cooking show, something I prepared in the oven earlier. We'll jump across to a project that's a little bit further along just to show you some of the more advanced functionality in that. The topic of this particular project is transcription, which I suspect if you're here at an NVivo session is probably something you may be interested in. And of course, there is a transcription session, as we were saying before, later on today at 4 o'clock as part of the ResBaz session. So it's timely that we're starting with that this morning. Once we've talked about the types of literature you can work with, I'm going to talk a little bit about taking notes and linking within a lit review project, and we'll then talk about coding and just how helpful that can be. A lot of the steps up until that point in today's session, you might be thinking, well, actually, I could do that in other software. But when you get to the coding stage of the process, I think that's going to be when the penny drops and you'll start to see just how helpful NVivo can be. That's the point where we're going to jump across to a more completed NVivo project. And at that stage, I'll show you what some of the queries functionality can offer. Queries, as you may have gathered yesterday, are one of my favorite features of the software, and we'll have a little bit more time in today's session just to be able to explore some of that functionality in a little bit more detail. Right, so on screen you should be seeing NVivo, and I've got just a few journal articles imported into this project. In terms of the types of literature you can work with in NVivo, the most obvious type is full text PDFs of journal articles. These days it's so easy for us to be able to access those. My hunch is, particularly if you've been researching for a while, that you will probably have hundreds if not thousands of PDFs of journal articles sitting somewhere on your computer system, and they can potentially be brought into NVivo. Other examples would be that you could potentially bring across just abstracts from some of the journal articles that you're interested in. It might be notes you've taken on books you've read, or even web pages and other types of PDFs that might be relevant. So anything that you've got that's text that is in electronic form that you can bring across to NVivo, it would be well worth considering that, with a few caveats. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about how it might be best not to bring absolutely everything into NVivo, because that can result in some quite big project file sizes. Now, a few things about this project that I've set up. First of all, you can see off to the left-hand side here, I've got some folders set up. Folders are a really useful tool. They're a really simple tool, actually, in NVivo. They are partly for organisation, and they're also partly helpful when you run queries later down the track. Remember, queries is something I'll be covering in the last part of today's session. So if you are perhaps searching for a particular keyword in your literature, but you only want to do that on a subset of your journal articles, depending on the way you have organised the PDFs of your journal articles, you can use the folders to narrow down the scope of your query quite quickly. Now, folders are your choice as the researcher. You don't have to have them, and you can create those at any stage as well. I like to have mine set up based on literature type, but I've seen other projects where researchers have perhaps got folders based on topic, on geographic location, if that's relevant, and time period is another example of the types of things I've seen in literature review projects. So whatever will be most helpful for you, you might like to just have a wee think about that for your own projects. Now, in terms of the files that we'll be working with today, I thought we might start by talking about these PDFs, and I'll just open one up to show you. And I've just spotted a comment in the chat about, can I make the screen bigger? So the screen is maximum size at my end, I'm afraid. What you will need to do is zoom in at your end on your Zoom app. So this does come up from time to time, people having trouble seeing the screen. You might just want to have a play around with the view settings or even just zoom in. I think you'll find that will help. So what have we got here? So I've just opened up one of the PDFs in this project. I'll just scroll down. I just wanted to show you that I can actually very specifically select text in this PDF. So this is possible because the original PDF was OCR. If that's not a term you are familiar with, that stands for optical character recognition. It's just a complicated way of saying that the text is in the original PDF file. If you have a PDF where you can actually select and highlight the text in the original file, that means it's OCR. And when you bring it into NVivo, that means you can select the text like I've just done. And it also means it's searchable, which is really helpful. Most recent PDFs are OCR, but depending on how far back you're going with your literature, some very old or very early PDFs of journal articles, you might find that they are scanned images. They can still be brought into NVivo, but you just don't have quite as much flexibility in terms of how you work with them. Now, I am in a moment going to be showing you how to bring one of these PDFs in so that you can see how that works. But the other thing I just wanted to show you was an example of the abstracts folder here. So I'm just opening up. So I mentioned earlier that it might be that you don't want to bring absolutely everything into your NVivo project. NVivo projects can be quite large, so they can actually be up to 10 gigabytes in size, which I can tell you from experience is absolutely huge. But the golden rule for working in NVivo is the smaller your project is, the faster it will run. So NVivo can slow down a little bit when you get into bigger file sizes. So I would suggest for a literature review project where there's potentially thousands of files that you might bring in, that you're actually just thinking a little bit strategically about what will be most helpful for you. So yes, you've got thousands of PDFs of journal articles on your computer system, but actually, what are the ones that you really want to read in depth, that you might want to search, that you might want to code, and just make some strategic decisions around what you're going to bring the full text in and what you might just bring in abstracts only. And that's essentially what you're seeing on screen. This is a Word document that I created and brought into NVivo. This was created from my reference management software. From memory at the time, I was an EndNote user, and it was a very simple drag and drop to bring in the citation, the reference, along with the abstract into a Word document so that I could bring it into NVivo. And even just having abstracts here is actually super helpful. Right. Now, I'm just going to show those two types of literature for today, but remember there are lots of different types of literature that you might be working with in NVivo. As long as they are in either Word or text format or PDF, you will be able to bring them into the software. Now, let me show you how that process works though. So I will just jump back to my journal articles folder. And I've got a PDF that I'm going to bring in just to show you how simple that is. So those of you that were here yesterday, I mentioned I love right-clicking in NVivo. It's pretty much the way to do everything, almost everything at least. So I've just right-clicked and I'm coming to import items. And this is my PDF of this particular journal article I'm going to bring in. I'll just click open and import. Just a wee tip for those of you on the Mac, it is possible to bring in multiple PDFs at once, but I do find on the Mac it's better to break them down into smaller batches. It's a little bit slower importing PDFs on the Mac, I find. So here we go. We've got the file being brought up. It's giving me an opportunity to rename this file. I'm going to leave it as is. I do, though, want to make a point about how I have named this. So there's a couple of recommendations in terms of how you name your literature for NVivo. One is that you can do what I've done here. So I've named mine by author and year. The other option is you can name it by the title of the article or book or whatever type of literature you're working with. People tend to have very strong opinions either way on this. It's always really fascinating talking to researchers. I'm very strongly in the author and year camp because that's how I remember my files. But equally, I've got colleagues who are very, very attached to naming their files by the title. Really, it's whatever will be most helpful to you. It doesn't make a huge difference either way, but I do recommend being consistent. So pick one of those systems and go with it rather than chopping and changing. That just tends to lead to a little bit of confusion. So let's just bring this in. There we go. So I've got the article is in my project. I'll just open that up for a quick look as well. But it's very cleanly and easily brought that article into NVivo. Right, I think that's all I wanted to say about bringing in literature. Just spotted a quick question that I'll tackle in the Q&A there, just to save Jane typing. Yes, you can do whatever you would like, Tim. So the question is whether or not you could do author, date, and title in terms of your file names. I think for me personally, I am a fan of keeping things as simple as possible. And if you've got author, date, and title, you're going to have some very, very long file names. And that's not how I personally like to work in NVivo, but that's absolutely fine if that works for you. One of the things you'll see shortly when we start to code is that when you bring up coding from literature, it actually shows you immediately above what the file name is. And so there's a lot to be said for having quite simple file names, just because that can be a really effective way for you to track through where things have come from. Just on that note, actually, things like files and folder names, whether or not it's NVivo for a literature review or you're working with NVivo with primary data, that is the kind of thing that it is actually worth having a bit of a think about up front. One of the resources we're sharing today, and I'll just ask Jane to pop it in the chat, is a NVivo project planning guide. So that's just a really simple PDF that you can download that will walk you through all of the decisions that you might want to think at the early stages of a project. And that includes things like file names and folder names. The project planning worksheet, look, to be honest, it's probably a little bit of overkill. I'm a bit of a planner. That's just my personality type. And I like to have everything sorted before I begin a project. But I have had some really good feedback from people about that guide. One of the issues with using NVivo is sometimes when you first start out, you don't know what you don't know. And that's what that worksheet is designed to overcome. It will help you think through all of the things that you need to be thinking about at the early stages of a project. Okay, so let's move across now. We've talked about literature and bringing it in. I'm going to talk briefly about note-taking. And I'm going to just close this PDF down. I'll move across. Down on the left-hand side here in the navigation view, you can see there is an area for notes, and underneath that you have a folder for memos. Now, memos are a qualitative research tool, actually. Memos are a place for you to record your own thoughts, thinking, and reflections about a project. My favourite way of describing memos is how my colleague Pat Baisley refers to them. She says, writing a memo is like having a discussion with yourself. It's such a perfect way of describing it. On a literature review project, you're probably going to be taking a lot of notes and making a lot of reflections about what it is you're reading. And memos are a really helpful place for you to store those notes, thoughts, and thinking for your lit review. I'm just going to open a memo up to show you by way of example. You can see I've actually got some subfolders here underneath memos. So we've got one for author-based memos, topic-based, and also just a general one, which is where I'm now. I'm just going to open up the literature review journal file. And this is just very early stages of a sort of log file that I've kept for this project, just keeping a record of the date and time and what actions I have taken within my NVivo project. Now, I must say that when I first started using NVivo for literature reviews, it was when I created my first memo in a project that I started to get really, really excited. I think I tend to give people the impression that I am terribly organized, but it's actually not my natural state. It's something that I have to work quite hard on. And I'm one of those researchers that if I let myself, and even now as I speak, I can see all sorts of post-it notes around my desk with little random notes of things I need to come back to later. And of course, that's not a really effective technique to be using when you're working on research projects or literature reviews. So what I really love about memos in NVivo is they are a central point for me to record all of my thoughts and thinking about my literature review. And that way, if later down the track I forget something or I need to refer back to something I've done, I know exactly where I need to go in my NVivo project to find that. So memos are just a general useful tool in NVivo, but I think they are particularly helpful on a literature review project. Okay, the other thing I promised to talk about in addition to notes was linking. I'm going to talk about a couple of different types of links today. I'm going to talk about annotations and something called see also links. I might do annotations first, and the file I'm going to open up is this one, AmeroJaff. I may be pronouncing that wrong actually. Every time I teach this workshop I think I must look that up. So I'm just coming down to one of the pages here in this particular PDF, and you can see here this journal article actually mentions that Davidson item that I've just imported to my project. And in fact, it mentions it a couple of times here. So we're going to add an annotation to the first instance and a see also link to the second. So annotations, they're similar to memos in a way in that they are for your own thoughts and thinking, but annotations are for shorter reflections that you might write, and they apply to a specific point of the text. So memos apply to a whole project, a whole piece of literature, or perhaps an entire code that you've created in NVivo. Whereas annotations, they're actually a little bit like, I was just waving my post-it notes, they're a little bit like writing a note on a post-it note and sticking it on a hard copy of a transcript. So they're just for little short comments that you want to add to a file. So I'm just going to add one here to Davidson. Now, the researcher or the author for this particular article is making a comment about something they read in Davidson, and I perhaps don't remember reading that, or I don't have the same understanding. So I just want to make a little note to myself here that that's something I want to go back and check later. So I've highlighted the reference there. I'm going to right-click over top, and I'll come down and choose New Annotation. I'm just going to type, I don't recall this being mentioned, need to check. I'll then just click back up into the document, and you can see I've got a little blue highlight. So that is an indicator on the Windows version of NVivo, at least, that I have an annotation attached. Annotations work a little bit differently on the Mac version of NVivo. You get a little pop-up bubble that appears on the screen. So, as I've said, annotations are for short little notes that you might want to make on the literature that you're reading. They're incredibly helpful as you are going through and reading the literature in your NVivo project. And they are just like putting a little note on a post-it note and sticking it onto a hard copy of something that you have been reading. Now, the next thing I'm going to show by way of linking is only available on the Windows version of NVivo. So apologies to those of you on the Mac version. This, at this stage at least, is Windows only. See also links are a way to connect to something else in your project. And it's almost like an internal hyperlink. It allows you to go from one part of your project to another. So in this particular example, we've got the reference to Davidson, and I have the full PDF of the Davidson article inside my NVivo project, so I can actually connect through to that. So I'll just right click on top of what I've highlighted. I'm going to come down, we've got a links menu here. I'll choose see also link and I'll make a brand new one. And I just need to find the Davidson item. Here we go. Click OK. And I get a slightly different coloured highlight this time. So annotations in NVivo are a blue highlight. See also links appear in pink. And I can actually see this appears down the bottom here. It's right next to where my annotations were earlier. So wherever you see that pink highlight, you know that that is connected to another item in your project. You can actually just double click on it down here in that little, it's almost like a footnote window that appears down the bottom. Alternatively, I can right click over top of the pink highlight and come down, I'm choosing links, open to item. And if I do that, that will open up the Davidson article. There we go. Word of warning for those of you that have procrastination tendencies. It is very easy for you to link yourself around in circles in an NVivo project, and I'd have to question how helpful that is. So I think linking is a really, really useful tool, particularly the annotations. And there are certainly some circumstances that I think you'll find the see also links will be helpful as well. But just be a little bit careful that you just don't end up looping yourself around in circles and not adding any value to the work that you're doing. We can get a little bit obsessed with setting up all sorts of complicated systems that don't necessarily move us forward. So if you're a procrastinator, use see also links in particular with great caution would be my advice. Okay. Coding is next on my list. I am working through this at a reasonably fast pace. I am just going to pause for a moment to check in to see if there's any questions that might be worth answering live. I can see there are a few there in the Q&A panel, Jane. So great question around, can you import OneNote pages as memos to NVivo? So at this stage, NVivo is compatible with both OneNote and Evernote. So you can actually bring across notes from either of those two online note-taking applications, and they will come across into NVivo. I have a sneaky feeling that that might not be available on the Mac. It's definitely available on Windows though. I am not a OneNote user. I have certainly used Evernote in the past though, and I used to actually use the Evernote NVivo import quite regularly, and I loved it. Unfortunately, well, fortunately for me, I've moved to Notion now, as I know Jane has as well, and Notion is not currently compatible. So that's a bit of a yes and no answer there. Can you go back to the original PDF after you've clicked on a see also link, e.g. using Control Z? So that's a great question. So Control Z won't work because that's undo. So that doesn't quite work as a back button, unfortunately, if that makes sense. I think I might have actually shown that. So I think that question might have come in just before I did the right click over top of the see also link. I went to links and open to item. So I think that answers that question. But Tim, let Jane and I know in the chat if I have misunderstood that question. And Nicolette has asked about, can you import PDFs directly from reference management software? I am indeed going to be covering that right at the end of today. So we'll do a quick demo of how EndNote works in relation to NVivo. So I'll come back to that. Anything else that's worth me addressing, Jane, in terms of, I can see there's some ones that you've answered already.
Thanks, Lynn. I know there's a question in the chat. Please don't do that because I worry I'll lose them. But I have noticed this one, and I think it also links to a question that I had before, which is about the properties. So this question's about codebook and having the codebook details show. And we've also had another question about changing names and changing descriptions and things. So perhaps just a quick recap on that.
That would be, that's excellent timing, actually. What I'll do is we're about to talk about coding, so I will cover those 2 questions as part of that. Right, let's then talk about code. So, one of the things that you may be disappointed in is that NVivo isn't actually going to analyse your literature for you. It's not going to do any of the writing for you. I'm hoping no one came today expecting that that would be the case. There are no shortcuts for those sorts of things. So very much reminded of that, actually. Jane and I both went to the AI for Literature review session on the very first day, and that was actually my takeaway from that session as well. Yes, there are some tools, but you actually still need to do the work as the researcher. So one of the great benefits of using NVivo for a literature review is the ability to code the literature. Now, when you are using NVivo for a project that's based on primary data, when you code at themes, encodes, and subcodes. So it's very much based on your analysis. When you code literature, you're probably going to be coding based on topic and subtopics, maybe even keywords, depending on the nature of the literature review you are working on. And so these codes that we can see here that I've started to pre-populate, as I joked before, it's a little bit like a bad cooking show. I've had some stuff in the oven. So these have been created by me as the researcher, and you will need to do the same for your own projects. Now, just 2 particular codes that I would recommend you have in all of your literature review projects. One is for definitions and the other is for great quotes. Now, great quotes is for anything that you know you're going to want to include verbatim in your literature review. The real, knock your socks off kind of quotes that you want to make sure you use verbatim. Really important tip here is if you are coding at great quotes, also code at whatever topic it relates to. NVivo then has something called a coding query, which allows you to look for everything at great quotes that's also been coded at one of your topics, and it's going to report to you, sort of like filtering down the results so that you can just see the quotes you need at that particular point in time. Definitions is one that I only ever have on literature review projects. So this project is about transcription. So anywhere where the authors have made a really, really clear definition of what the act of transcription involves, I would code that at my definitions code. My PhD was on self-regulated learning, so if I had used NVivo for my lit review for that, I didn't because that wasn't a thing back then, probably showing my age a bit there, then anything where an author had really clearly defined self-regulated learning and I knew I wanted to capture that, then I would pop that at the definitions code. Now, these other codes that I've got already set up here, they're pretty much based on topic. Remember, this particular project is all around transcription. So I'm just going to show you a couple of quick pieces of coding here, and then I'll jump across to this project that I have moved a little bit further along. So let me just get to the right place. So we want to be in Davidson. I'm going to move down. Apologies if I'm giving you whiplash by whipping through this. Here we go. This is what I want. So got a chunk of text here that is around working with transcribers, and you can see I have a code called transcribers. One of my favorite ways to code in NVivo, and this works exactly the same across both Windows and Mac versions, is to drag and drop. So what I'll do is I'm hovering my mouse over the text, I click and hold, I pull over to transcribers and I let go. And that's me done coding. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. I'll just open up the transcribers code. And there we go. So I can actually see that this is highlighted. So I've got that chunk of text from the Davidson article is inside the transcriber's code. So it's kind of almost like it's cut a chunk of the text out and it's popped it into a box that relates to that particular idea. Just going to close that down, and I'll show you one more quick technique for coding. So just a bit further down, there's some text that relates to transcription and technology. Show you a slightly different coding technique this time. I'll right-click over top, and I will choose code selection. Now, inevitably, every time I do this, it pops the dialog box onto the wrong screen. So there we go. I've had to go hunting for that behind all the windows that I've got open. So I want to code this, add a code for technology, and I'm going to pop it underneath practicalities here. So I'm just going to type in technology, press enter, and I can click this code button down the bottom. So this time I didn't have the code, and I've sort of made the code and done the coding at the same time. So that's a more inductive technique for coding that I've just shown. Now, it's a little bit hard to understand how coding works unless you see a project that's got a fair bit of coding done. So I am going to move across, but just before I do that, just coming back to that question that Jane raised before around changing names and how you enter descriptions for a code book, I'm just going to come here on transcribers. Let's say that I wanted to change that to working with transcribers. So the way to do that, it's slightly different across Windows, Mac. On Windows, we right-click over top, and I come down, there's an option, Code Properties. On the Mac, the option you're looking for is called Get Info. So it's also a right-click, but it's Get Info instead of Properties. So I'm just going to make the name change there, and I'll click OK. And you can see that that's updated. Now, I think what confuses people here, this is such a common question I get in these types of webinars, is when people right-click, they look for a rename option off the list, and there isn't one. It's not the language that NVivo uses. So regardless of whatever type of item you want to change the name of, whether it's a document, a memo, a code, something else, you right-click over top. On Windows, you choose the property option, and on the Mac, it's Get Info. Now, just coming back to that question about code books being empty. So code books, when you export them, they will only be populated if you have entered information here into the description field. So the question that came in earlier around my code book's empty when I export it, I suspect what's happened is that you don't have that description field entered. So check that out and maybe let Jane and I know, but via the Q&A panel rather than the chat, just so that we can make sure we've answered that question. So I'll just click cancel, and bear with me while I jump across to my other example. Can I suggest, because we've been going for 40 minutes, I need about 30 seconds to switch to the other project. Stand up, twirl around, stretch, give yourself a bit of a shake while I am doing that, because it's a long time, an hour, to be sitting glued to a screen. So while you are hopefully waking yourselves up a bit with a bit of movement, I'm just jumping across to this other example that I've got, and we'll show you what it looks like when you've done a little bit more coding. Great stuff. Okay, so you can see here, let's actually open all of these up. So we've got a number of codes here. We've actually got 23 codes have been set up. And if you have a look here, you've got quite a number of files and references showing for each of these codes. So a bit of work's been done here. Even though we've only got a small number of journal articles in this project, it's generated a reasonable amount of coding. I'll open up this code here. So this is all to do. Remember, this is topic-based in this project. I've got a topic here, benefits of transcription, and I'll just double-click that to open it up. And essentially, this is showing me everything from all of the literature I've read that relates to benefits of transcription. So I, as the researcher, have gone through, I've coded my journal articles to these codes. I'm now at the hypothetical writing up stage, we'll say, and I want to write up something that talks about the benefits of transcribing on a qualitative research project. I open up the code that relates to that topic, and everything is in one place. So I can actually read through this. I would need to summarize it in my own words in my writing, but this is everything to do with that topic in one place. So just to emphasize, the work has been done in this project. It's not that NVivo magically, automatically identified everywhere that the literature talked about benefits of transcription. This was a manual process that the researcher has gone through, reading the PDFs, coding it at the relevant topics, but because that work has been done, we beautifully have everything appearing in one place. And if you're a little bit unsure as to whether NVivo would be helpful for lit reviews, I'm hoping by seeing that is where you might have had a little bit of a spark of excitement. It's usually that part of the webinar that people get a little bit excited. Now, two quick things I want to show you here. One is once you have coded from a piece of literature, I can see the coding here, obviously, but it's also linked back to where it came from. So this is from the Grundy article. You can see, hopefully here, why it's so helpful to be simple with your file names, because they appear as these blue hyperlinks. I'm going to right-click over top of that paragraph that I've coded, and I'm choosing Open Referenced File. And so that is going to open up the original Grundy article, and you can see that that text that I'd coded is highlighted in context. So that is super useful. The other thing we can do here, I'm just going to turn the highlight off so it doesn't confuse matters. Just going to come to, got an option here for coding stripes. I showed this yesterday, but this is a little bit more, the coding's been done in a little bit more detail here. So coding stripes appear down the right-hand side of the screen here. I'm just going to scroll down. You can see I'm getting coloured stripes that actually shows me where everything has been coded. So I'm just hovering over. This is about participant transcribers. This is about software and technology. This is about external transcribers. So I can actually see for a piece of literature all of the places that that's been coded, and that can be incredibly helpful. Right, let's finish off the session by talking about queries, and then we'll do a quick talk about reference management software. Let's close all these down. So queries are ways of asking questions in NVivo, and you can query your text or you can query your coding. I'm going to show you examples of both of those. Now, querying your text on a project that is based on primary data can be a little bit so-so, and that's because usually you're talking to human beings in your qualitative research, and we tend to not use words in the exact same way across different people, across different contexts. So if you are searching for a very specific keyword in primary data, it doesn't necessarily always bring what you expect up, just because of the variation, the natural variation in how people speak. Literature, though, often has very particular keywords and jargon terms that are used, and that makes searching your text actually quite effective. So there are a couple of queries we're going to run here. I'm going to show a word frequency query, which is something I also showed in yesterday's session, and we'll do a quick search for a very specific term as well. So I'm just coming to the Explore tab of the ribbon. I am conscious, by the way, folks, that I am presenting at quite a fast pace just because I'm trying to get as much of these functions shown to you as possible today. Remember that we are recording the session, so you can go back over anything later. So I'll click here on word frequency query, and that's going to pop it off to the side. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to ask for 100. So I'm asking for the 100 most frequently occurring words in the literature. By default, it's going to search across everything, but I can narrow that down to a particular folder if I wanted to. Minimum length I'm going to set to 5. Now, those of you that attended yesterday's workshop, you might recall that I set that to 4. On a literature review project, I always use minimum 5. So it's the minimum number of characters in the word for NVivo to count it. And the problem is if you set it to 4, on a lit review project, it brings up the years of publication. and that's not necessarily super useful. So if I'm searching a lit review project with this word frequency query, I always set it to minimum 5, and that avoids any years of publication. NVivo has a stop words list, so there are certain words like and, if, not, or, those kind of things are already excluded. You don't need to worry about those, but it is helpful just to have that set a little bit higher. So I'm just going to run this query so that you can get a sense as to what this shows, and it's essentially giving you top 100 most frequently occurring words from most frequent to least frequent. Something we showed yesterday is that you can double click on these words and it will take you through to the context, which is really helpful. And then the other thing I'll just quickly show is that we can get a word cloud here. So I can actually ask to see a visual of the most frequently occurring words. The word cloud that appears, essentially the words that occur more frequently, are in a larger font, which is really fab. Just to save Jane a bit of typing, someone is going to ask, can I export that? The answer is yes. So just right-clicking over anything in NVivo means that you can choose an export option here. So I find those word frequency queries really, really helpful. They are a more general query, but on a literature review project, they are super, super helpful. The other type of query is searching for a very specific instance of a word. So I'm just going to close this down. And one of the things that I know this particular set of literature talks about is errors in transcription. So errors seems like a useful word to search. So this time, rather than the most frequent, we're looking for a very specific word. So I'll just click here on text search. And I'll just pop in here the word errors. I'll run that query. So this is looking through, once again, by default, it's everything in my project. I can narrow it down to a specific folder if I wanted to. So it initially just tells me where it found that particular term. If I click down the side to reference, that's actually going to show me the finds themselves. So I can actually see that word error with 5 words context either side. And the other view that is quite helpful is just down the side here, we've got an option for word tree. And this is a visual. I'm going to have to, I've zoomed out a bit far there, haven't I? It might be one of those things that depends on how you're holding your mouth at the time, I think, in terms of where I'm clicking. So this is actually showing me all of the finds of the word errors. And it's grouping together the word that occurs just before and just after. And so I can actually see here, people have talked about grammatical errors, transcription errors. That's not surprising. And so sometimes when you actually look at these word trees, it is super helpful for you to get a sense of the patterns in terms of how people have talked about particular terms. So I'm hoping that those 2 examples give you a sense of how helpful searching your text can be on a lit review project. The thing we're going to do in the last 10 minutes today is start to talk about something called classifications and attributes in NVivo. And that also connects to the reference management stuff that I'm going to cover as well. So when you are using NVivo for a project based on primary data, often you want to bring things like descriptive or demographic characteristics into your project. So yesterday I showed how we can incorporate things like age group and gender and those kind of characteristics, and you can then use those in running queries. On a literature review project, you also have descriptive information. You have the year of publication, what journal an article was published on. You might have information about the thrust of the article, the methodology used. There's all sorts of different kinds of characteristics that you might want to explore in your literature. And NVivo allows you to set those up as classifications. Now, I have got some classifications set up for this project. I'm just going to very quickly open that up to show you. So these are ones that I've set up myself. I will show you in a moment what happens when you bring journal articles across from EndNote. That will also populate this kind of information. I'm a bit particular about what I include in my NVivo projects though, and I actually like to create my own classification sheets for my projects. And so this is set up by me, And I've got information, obviously the year of publication is really, really helpful. I've got the discipline the authors were from, the country the research was done in or published from, and also the journal as well. So rather than just bringing absolutely everything about each article in, I just have a smaller subset of these attributes, they're called in NVivo. And the purpose of having these in NVivo is if you want to query the coding you've done. So this kind of information on its own wouldn't be super helpful. But when you have gone through that process of coding literature in NVivo, if you want to ask what people said after 2010 versus before 2010, or if you want to know what the Australians said versus the Canadians versus the folks from the US, if you've got your literature labelled with these characteristics, it enables you to ask those sorts of questions. So I have got a coding query set up in this project so that you can see what that looks like. And so I'll just actually show you, this is querying I've got some codes in this project around transcription quality. So you can see the coding has been done. And you also saw on that little sheet that I just brought up that we had the discipline of the author categorized as well. So I'm not going to run this from the beginning just in the interest of time. I'm just going to double click on this and that will run it for me. And so what this is doing is comparing the discipline that each set of authors was from across those codes in my project. So I can actually see there was a fair bit of talk about errors, and it looks like lots of the education authors talked a fair bit about that. Interesting, got a few from accounting as well, not so much social science. Now, obviously this will be influenced by the number of disciplines that each article was from in the original set of literature. But what I really love about these queries is that it's not just quantifying the information. This then allows me to explore what was said. So if I want to see what the education authors said about errors, I'm very interested in that because my background's education. So I'm just going to double click on that 9. And that takes me through. This is exactly what the education authors said about transcription errors. And I can read through that. And then I might jump back to my table and I might want to know what the accounting authors said. So I can double click on the 3. And this is showing me exactly what the accounting authors said. And from memory, actually, this is just from one article in the project, which is also quite helpful to know. So I find that super exciting, that ability to take the coding I've done of my literature and then filtering it down based on particular characteristics or descriptive information. That is super, super helpful on a literature review project. But I suspect quite a number of you might have come today because you were interested in NVivo and reference management software. So let's just do a quick check while I'm just going to jump across to EndNote for a moment. Let Jane and I know in the chat what reference management software you're using. EndNote, Zotero, Mendeley, RefWorks, Citavi, something else. Let us know quickly. I always have a huge debate every time I run this session because I'm actually a Zotero user. But, oh, it's lovely to see so many Zotero folk. Fab. But I typically find there are lots of EndNote folk come to this session, and I can see that that's the case as well. So I'm going to demonstrate with EndNote, but the steps that I'm about to cover work exactly the same in Zotero and work exactly the same in the other applications as well. So just to recap there are 5 reference management applications that are compatible with NVivo. EndNote, obviously, Zotero, Citavi, which is actually produced by the same software company, Lumivero, Mendeley and RefWorks. So all 5 of them you can work with NVivo. Now, I've just got a very tiny set of references here, and those of you familiar with EndNote will see that we have got some paper clips attached, which tells me that the PDF is associated with the reference. So regardless of what reference management software you're using, it's a two-step process here. You need to export your references and then you import them to NVivo. So I'm just going to come up to File and choose Export. And just a couple of changes here on EndNote. I need to change this to XML and I want RIS, that's perfect. So I'll click Save. Now I'm going to jump back to NVivo and I might just close this down, come back to Files. And when I right click and choose Import From, you can see that all of the 5 options for reference management are here. I'll just choose EndNote off the list and I'll double click the file. This, just to let you know, is one of the places that you can opt for either title or author year. So that was why I drew everyone's attention to that earlier. I change that to author year and I'll click import. So very quickly, it has actually brought in the PDFs that were attached to my references in my EndNote library. You can see one of them is here. And the other thing it has done is it has brought in a classification sheet. So I've just opened up, it's a much bigger one. You can see there's lots of actual empty values here, but it has brought in things like the year of publication, the fact that it's a journal article, the author name. So by default, a lot of that classification information, a lot of those attributes have actually been brought across from reference management software. Now, big caveat here, I have just demoed that for you, but that is not how I use NVivo for lit reviews myself. So for me personally, I just find there's actually quite a few steps in that process. I've got to export from EndNote or Zotero, I've got to import to NVivo. And one of the gotchas here is that it's not a dynamic link between. So once I've done that process, if I then update EndNote or Zotero, I then need to go through all those steps again to update my NVivo project. And I just find the workflows are a little bit complex, unnecessarily so. So I personally just directly bring in my PDF files and I assign attributes from there. But I know lots of people do like this ability to link to EndNote and Zotero, so I'm glad we had just enough time to demonstrate that right at the end. Okay, folks, it is 11:55. If anyone needs to race off to another meeting, feel free. Jane and I are able to hang around for a few minutes, though, to answer any unanswered questions. So if we haven't answered your question, hang tight. We're just going to check the Q&A panel. And if you have a question that you haven't asked us yet, you better get that very quickly into the Q&A. And Jane has also just encouraged you to, if you've got a key takeaway, pop that in the chat, or even let us know, are you excited, not excited? It's not everyone's cup of tea, but we'd love to know what your thoughts are in terms of NVivo for literature reviews. Now, questions in the chat. Great. Sorry, questions in the Q&A, not the chat. Right, there's some good ones there. So there is a question about, could I show how to export the codebook? I actually covered that in yesterday's session. So I might get Jane just to pop in the chat a link to yesterday's webinar recording. And we did actually go through how to export the codebook as part of that session. So that is just in the chat to help you answer that particular question. Anna has asked, can you have a general note attached to the entire article? And if so, can you include images? Love that question. Yes, you can. Anna is the short answer. What you can actually do is you can attach a memo to a piece of literature. I'm actually just going to quickly show you that. So let's say I want to attach a memo, a note to Davidson. I right click over top, I choose memo link, and there's an option link to new memo. And I'll put memo about Davidson. There we go. And that then will open up on the right-hand side here a memo. I can write my reflections in. And if I just close this, what actually happens is in the list view here in NVivo, you get a really tiny icon. It's a little link symbol, and that shows me that I have a note attached to that particular piece of literature. Now, to answer the second part of your question, Anna, can you include images in it? Yes, you can. So memos can include images, text, colour, bold, underline, all those sorts of things. So that would be the way to do that, and I think that's a really lovely idea. Alex has asked, could I show coding something by region, e.g. a diagram in a PDF? I've tried doing this, but when I go into the coding area, it's not showing the diagram. Okay, I think I know what the problem might be there. So I don't think any of these articles have got images, unfortunately, but I can show a region. So up here on the ribbon, the default is always text when you've got a PDF open. I'm just going to choose region instead. And if we pretend this paragraph is an image, I'll just select that and I'll drag and drop it to, got an empty code there. So if I drag and drop to other, and I'll just go in to show you what that looks like. I think what trips people up here is that when you first go into the code, if you've coded by region, it actually gives you some numbers instead of what it is you've coded, and that throws lots and lots of people. Just down the right-hand side, you've got a series of tabs, and what you want to do is go to the PDF tab, and that actually will show you there what it is you've coded. So it's just an extra step. By default, it's going to show you literally the pixel region on the page. But if you click on that PDF tab down the side, it should show you the diagram. Let us know if that doesn't fix the issue. Anna's also asked, is there any color coding capability such as in Zotero? So not the same as Zotero, Anna, is the short answer to that question. So you can color code documents, you can color code codes, but it's quite limited. The good news is though, and this does change a little bit as other software updates, but the last time I checked a Zotero import, it did bring across your colored highlights from your PDFs in Zotero. So that might solve some of your issue, but yeah, color coding in NVivo is pretty limited. Right, I'm going to take a big breath because boy, did I talk lots, didn't I, Jane? How are we going in the question and answer? Have we tackled the more burning ones there? Yep, all done.
I think so. Thank you. And lots of really reassuring feedback that this is helpful, and that for people who are struggling to kind of keep hold of everything in literature review, this is a really good option. So that's fab.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Jane. Well, apologies for going a little bit over time. Thanks for sticking with us. Thanks very much for your engagement today, and thanks to Jane for hanging around at the end here to answer those questions. I've just seen another one pop up actually, so I will tackle that in a moment. So huge thanks to Jane for being behind the scenes and tackling all of your questions. Let's just quickly deal with that question because it's a really good one. So question is, I've done the initial coding and themes using Excel, now thinking of using NVivo. It seems like a lot of work. Again, what would be the best way? If you have used Excel and that is working for you, stick with it. Unfortunately, the work you have done in Excel may not translate well across to NVivo. Excel files can be imported to NVivo, but unfortunately NVivo expects them to be a survey. And depending on the structure of the Excel file you've used for your lit review, that might not come in very well, and NVivo might get terribly confused and it would be a huge amount of work. I don't think you necessarily need to switch to a new system just because it's got a few whiz-bang bells and whistles. I think if you have a system that is working well with you, just stick with that system. There's a lot to be said for that. Maybe you can think about using NVivo for a lit review on a later project. And just that last question, yes, the recording of the session will be available just like yesterday. So I will send that out later this afternoon. It just takes a little bit to process the recording. Okay, folks, what I am going to do is officially stop us there, but Jane and I will hang around in case there are any other unanswered questions you'd like us to tackle. Have a great rest of your day, stay warm and dry, and I hope you really enjoy any other ResBaz sessions that you're attending. And I will be in touch later on today with all of the links and resources from today's session, as well as the recording. So thanks for your engagement today, everyone. Jane and I think it would be fair to say we had a huge amount of fun today. Again.
Absolutely. It's great. Thank you for all the great questions. 30 all up today.
Wow. Kept you busy.
Did.
Okay.
I like it.